From co-founding Design It For Us to speaking with lawmakers and in the White House, you've become a really prominent voice in advocating for safer social media platforms for young people specifically. What first sparked your urgency to fight for this cause?
So I really got into this work because of the concerns that I had around how social media was influencing our elections. I worked in politics when I was 15, and I interned for a congressional campaign. And it was the first time that I really got to see the impact of how social media can have on our democracy. It wasn't until a couple years later, like peak COVID, everyone's in their homes locked down, and there's this documentary on Netflix called The Great Hack. And it's all about this organization called Cambridge Analytica, this company that was hired by Facebook and then hired by the Trump campaign. And it was fascinating to me at the way in which the technology that Cambridge Analytica employed was able to target specific elections. And I was really concerned about a specific country called Trinidad and Tobago, because that's where my family is from. And the way in which this technology was essentially swaying an election that people had no idea about. And to me, that was a real cause for concern. It was an understatement to say it was impacting our US elections. And so I basically discovered this organization called the Real Facebook Oversight Board when I was a freshman in college. And they asked me to come and help work on their digital strategy. I had zero experience. I have no idea why they trusted me or asked me to do this, but they did. And I spent almost 4 years there, where the executive director and the leadership there really helped me understand the policy world, the advocacy space, and connect with other people who are leading the way in what is a really nascent space. This hasn't existed for that long. So that ability to connect with people was really integral, and it ultimately laid the foundation for my work that I do today, which was understanding that intersection of mental health, young people, and social media.
Yeah, and I think you're starting to touch on the biggest issues within big tech. But one moment that I want to bring you back to is in 2023. It was leaked in a case that Facebook evaluates the lifetime engagement of a user at $270 if they're 13 years old. That's their lifetime profit value. So at a later Senate hearing with Mark Zuckerberg present, you and several other activists wore shirts that said, "I'm worth more than $270. To you and to your friends, how is this slogan emblematic of the larger problems with big tech and social media?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So to take a step back, this statistic comes from a internal meta study, which essentially valued the lifetime, the lifetime value of a teenager on the platform as being $270. That means that if you as a young person spend all your time on Facebook over your lifetime, to you they are worth $270. And to us, that was a scary statistic that the company was thinking about young people, us, in the context of a dollar amount and not as human beings or our well-being. And so ultimately, we took that number and we were like, we need to show this to the world. We need to make sure that people are aware of it. And so that's where the kind of thinking behind that number came from. We only know that because 42 state attorneys general decided to sue Facebook, Meta. And we only know that because of the work that a whistleblower named Frances Haugen did to bring together a set of documents that she ultimately took from Facebook and made public to Congress and the SEC. And so that trajectory, I think, led us up to that moment. But the moment that you're talking about was pretty visceral for a lot of me and my fellow activists. We stood up behind Mark Zuckerberg in a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, and the story is kind of crazy. We were wearing these T-shirts, and we wanted to make an impact, but we weren't exactly sure when our moment was going to be. The committee took a break for whatever reason, and that allowed us a moment to just catch our breath. And I remember walking outside of the hearing room and running into a congressional staffer that I knew, and she goes, "Hey, can you remind me what the statistic is? Where does it come from?" And I explained it to her, and she goes, "Okay, I think we're going to change one of our questions that we were going to ask." So she's referring to her boss. The senator was going to ask a different question. I was like, okay. So I texted in our group chat. I was like, this is probably going to come up. And my colleague, our executive director at Accountable Tech, she goes, you make sure you stand up. Whatever happens, make sure you stand up. So the senator turns to Mark Zuckerberg during the hearing and goes, you put a lifetime valuation of $270 on teenagers. There are young people who are here today wearing T-shirts. Could you please turn around and look at them? And so he kind of turns around to look at us. You could very clearly tell he was very uncomfortable. He did not want to be looking at us. He locks eyes with one of my friends for a brief moment, and then turns away. And we stayed standing for as long as we possibly could, because we knew kind of like this, where all the photographers were sitting in front, and we're hopefully going to be capturing that moment. And Capitol Police come up on my left-hand side, and I just said to my friend Ava, I was like, whatever you do, don't look at Capitol Police. Just keep your head down, keep your head down. And then eventually they made us sit down, because they were no forms of protesting. But it really got a lot of attention, and I think it resonated for people in a way that I was surprised by. I think it's kind of a wonky stat in terms of how you think about it, but we tried to distill it out to what it really meant, which was this company thinking about value of young people as a metric and not as people.
I mean, one thing that you said that stood out to me is that, you said he didn't want to be looking at us. He did not want to turn around. Corporations don't want to turn around. And when people are monetized, they're not treated as people anymore. That leads me to my next question. What are some of the subtle design features that Meta uses, that Facebook uses, that you wish more people were aware of, that target young people specifically?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because ultimately all of the design features that Instagram uses are no different from the other companies. Just by a show of hands, how many of you grew up pretty much on YouTube, Instagram, and Snapchat? Okay, so primarily all of us. And because of that, it's a very small number of companies who are designing basically our entire digital ecosystem. And so to your point, they employ a lot of the same design features. Those design features are meant to keep us on the platform longer. And we all know that. I think for the most part, we recognize that. The challenge is the struggle in knowing that you know that, and then when do I leave Instagram? When do I take a break from it? Do I delete the app? Do I need to add one of the Apple time limits to give myself some friction? But all of what social media is geared towards today is about keeping you on the platform for longer. And so a lot of those design features are they're so baked in that we don't even think about them as design features. There are things like endless scroll, push notifications, streaks on Snapchat. Streaks are specifically designed to keep you coming back to Snapchat every day because you don't want to lose the streak. And Snapchat has noticed that, recognized that, and built in a subscription now, so that if you are a 14-year-old on Snapchat and you lose your streak with your best friend, well, you're going to ask your parents to buy Snapchat Plus so you can save that streak with your friend. So, this is kind of the face value, I think, what all of us have come to understand and expect. Where it starts to get darker, and what the core of the work that we do, that Design It For Us does, is around the more difficult, challenging mental health work. And so these, for example, these are things like face-altering beauty filters on TikTok. For a while, and maybe they still do this, TikTok enabled a filter whenever you turned on the camera that you wouldn't be aware of. So they wouldn't send you like a notification of like, hey, we've turned on this beauty filter. They just turned it on. So if you were to go to your camera app and look at yourself the same way, you would actually look different. And maybe to yourself, you would look worse than you did on TikTok. That TikTok employees, and again, we only know this because of a AG lawsuit against the company, those beauty filters were raising concerns inside the company. Employees were aware that it was causing harm, and they were aware that in their focus groups, young people were reporting that this was causing them mental health challenges. But they have, to the best of my knowledge, not turned it off. It remains a feature on the platform, and those are the same kinds of trends that we're seeing across the social media space.
And given these features, we all know they exist. But I think the issue is, where do they become a problem? Because on the one hand, of course, this is a business, and businesses have a prerogative to earn profit. At what point do activists like yourself consider this to cross the line? It's now a predatory tactic rather than just a business practice.
Yeah, so I have kind of the privilege and responsibility in my position of knowing some of the people who work at these companies, who work on trust and safety, and who are responsible ultimately for youth safety at these companies. Not all of them engage with me or us. Some are not interested in what we have to say or what I think, which is fine. But for the ones that do, I notice a real struggle that they sometimes have internally, that they sometimes have within the company, about how they can inflict change on their company. Each of these companies has created a trust and safety team or a youth safety team to create a better product. But ultimately, the power rests in the profit incentives. And that's where I feel some sympathy for my colleagues who work at these companies, who are trying to push these common sense safeguards along. And where they know that the research that they're seeing, the work that they're doing, is actually going to have a material impact, but they can't get through. So I'll give you an example. In one of the AG lawsuits, and thanks to some of the whistleblower testimony, Instagram did a project or a test called Project Daisy. They essentially turned off like counts by default. So you can all go in and like turn off the like count on your post. I mean, I do that if I post something. I think it seems like it's like generally becoming commonplace for more like upper Gen Z college students to do that. But what Instagram did is they turned it off for everyone in their small test group. And I think this was done in Australia and maybe in the US, but don't quote me on that. What they ended up finding was that when they turned off like counts by default, it improved well-being on the platform overwhelmingly. But they had already spoken publicly about concerns they had with the effectiveness of the project. So what they were saying publicly was very different from what was happening internally. And Adam Mosseri, the head of Instagram, essentially had something very different to say on Good Morning America when he talked about the outcomes of this study than what actually was going on inside the company. And a lot of employees at Instagram were really concerned when this was never officially implemented, because Instagram's public stance was, hey, this doesn't actually work, but internally it actually did. And so that's where I derive a lot of my concern about the industry that we're seeing right now. I understand the value of innovation and profit, and by no means am I here or speaking to you as somebody who thinks we should ban social media. But we should all be able to acknowledge that the profits incentives and the structures aren't working right now, where everything is so geared to your engagement because that's ultimately what makes them dollars. When they can serve you another ad, they make more money. And as a result, I think that just creates a dependency problem. It creates these mental health concerns that we're talking about. And I think that the line is becoming increasingly clearer about what is and isn't working right now. Because I think a lot of young people are waking up to those concerns.
Yeah, I think the word profit here is really interesting because something that Design at First recently posted on their Instagram is that distracted people are profitable. This also reminds me of Oxford's 2024 word of the year that we were just talking about earlier. The word was brain rot, and brain rot was described as the intellectual deterioration and brain fog that occurs after this overconsumption of mindless, senseless content that I don't need to describe because I'm sure all of you know what it is. How, if at all, do social media platforms benefit from creating and promoting these markets like the brain rot market?
So like you, I'm also not going to share examples of what brain rot is because that would be embarrassing. But I think like we all generally know what it is. It's really interesting because it's like kind of this almost like subculture of social media right now. I'm sure that like the companies have understood something that's going on their platform. I think it's really fascinating that this trend of brain rot has emerged. And it can mean lots of things. It can mean simply the fact that you are like saying senseless things that make sense to some people. It can also be like the Subway Surfer thing on like an interview where you watch half the interview and you watch the Subway Surfer. I think that's all like part of this trend. I think ultimately what it boils down to though is our attention spans have become so fraught that this kind of content proliferates in a space where we are craving the next fix. And by that I mean these algorithms are created the same way that like slot machines are made at a casino, where you pull the lever the same way that you pull the swipe down for that gratification, for that dopamine boost. And I think that kind of content works because people are looking for ways to regenerate their attention. But isn't that crazy? Like, isn't that crazy that we're becoming so numb to our own attention spans that we need to create new ways of talking about or sharing a piece of content because otherwise we wouldn't be that interested? Like I'm sure, I don't know what the stat is, but I'm sure it's increasingly lower the amount of time that you have to be like engaged into a video or a reel or a TikTok before you scroll past. And so I think that's like why this has emerged. And I don't think that in and of itself it's a problem, but I think it speaks to a bigger problem about how our social media has basically been created the way it is today.
I mean, as we've been talking about this entire conversation, social media platforms use their algorithms to maximize engagement, to increase time spent, to increase targeted advertising. But at the same time, a lot of us have this idea, there's a current trend about curating your Instagram feed, or this idea that you get to choose what you see online. How much do you agree with that statement that you have control over your Instagram feed?
Yeah. So I'm the upper end of Gen Z. So I think my experience maybe slightly differs from some of you, maybe is similar to others. Like I remember when Instagram was so chronological and you literally just followed your friends and that was it, which seems crazy to think about today because it's this entirely different ecosystem. And to your point, we now curate our Instagram feeds, our accounts to look a certain way because of the social pressures that we feel. Like, I think most people can attest to that. But what the real core of social media is, or at least what people thought it up to be, you know, when Mark Zuckerberg was developing Facebook, when Evan Spiegel was developing Snapchat, aside from the weird stuff that they were doing to like come up with those things, like, you know, Zuckerberg wanted to like compare like who was hotter to one another at Harvard. The goal of social media was connection, was community. And I think we've become so distant from what that actually ultimately was. And that's why we crave social media that brings us back to that connection and that community. So I think that's why like Be Real briefly had its like spike. I don't know if anyone still uses Be Real, but I think it created an opportunity for people to like re-engage with their friends digitally in a way that was like purely organic. It wasn't curated. You like had to do what you were doing. And then I think, you know, over time people were like timing their Be Real to be in like a cool place or whatever. But I think the curation of our Instagram feeds has become so innate. It's kind of a part of our growing up. It's like why Finstas like developed, or, you know, like your fake Instagram account, because people wanted another opportunity to showcase to their friends a side of them that they didn't want to share with everyone else. I mean, the research inside these companies suggests that it is a challenge for young people to have to curate their social media. So I definitely see it as something that, you know, we shouldn't have to contend with or like are definitely challenged by having to do this, but we don't think about it like that. It's just so innate now.
Yeah, and on this idea, you've mentioned in interviews before how when you try to distance from social media or you try to get off of social media, there's a social cost to it, which is this feeling of FOMO or disconnect after you're not online. So what in your personal experience has been helpful in navigating this type of social cost and developing a mindful relationship with social media?
Good question. I think it's really difficult because it's going to manifest differently for different people. The social cost is something that, again, inside the company research suggests and is core to keeping these platforms running. If Instagram continues to make sure that you will feel bad about leaving, then they're going to find ways to make sure that you keep coming back. I think being able to create friction is a sense of autonomy. It is putting some control back on the onus of you to do what we Design It For Us believe is like create some autonomy and control back in your digital ecosystem. We Design It For Us did this campus tour in the fall. And we went to 5 college campuses across the country, and we did events similar to this, but we brought some diverse speakers together on a range of different areas, but they were all focused on responsible social media and responsible tech. And at the end, we did this poll with all the participants at each of these locations. And overwhelmingly, people told us they wanted more autonomy back in their social media experience. They wanted more autonomy back in their lives. They wanted that disruption, that friction. And, but by the same token, we recognize that there's so much community that is fostered on social media. Like this event was shared on social media. This is part of a community here on Berkeley's campus that has value to people. It's why all of you showed up today, which I appreciate, thank you. And so that aspect of community is, I think, ultimately what we seek and what we crave from social media, and what we lack a lot of right now in the ecosystems that we've been given. And I say that to say that there are a very small number of companies who dictate our entire digital experience. There are a very small number of people, primarily men, white men from this city, who develop and create the ecosystems that we've grown up on, that we were socialized on. And so I think that challenge of having to contend with the same few companies and the same environments and ecosystems, it makes us feel like that there is no other choice, that there are very few options. And frankly, that's because there are. Like, the tech industry works hard to stifle its competition. We know that because Google, for example, is getting sued because it's an illegal monopoly. The tech industry fights its competition and then gobbles it up. And as a result, we are all worse off. We could have 10 to 15 different apps that we use on social media, each for a specific different thing that maximizes the value of community and photo sharing or storytelling that we all find valuable, cooking videos, whatever the case is. But instead, we've basically been given the 3 or 4 apps that we use today. And that is by design. Like, that is because this industry recognized that if they could essentially create an oligopoly of the entire control centered around a couple companies, they could dictate and control most things. I mean, the lobbying power that these companies have is immense. As a country, we've never seen companies the size of these. And as a result, it gives the CEOs and the people who work at these companies, but especially the executives, an outsized control on things beyond our digital ecosystems, on things like our democracy, on things like our elections. It's why Mark Zuckerberg is buying a house in Washington, D.C., because, as my colleague put it, he essentially thinks of himself, or as Meta, as a nation state. And they've got to have an embassy in D.C. because they've got to make sure that they liaise with the government. So I think all of that is what has contributed to the structure that we see today. And yeah, I mean, I think over time we're going to need to do more to address this.
So despite all of this, rather than eliminating social media altogether, Design It For Us and yourself advocates for an approach where social media is reformed to become safer. And at the same time, you also say that the burden of responsibility for making the platform safer should rely within the platform rather than us to self-police our habits and our behaviors. So what key policy reforms are you currently looking to achieve through your work?
So let me take a step back for a second to just set a little bit of context, because I don't think I've done this since we got up here. So Design It For Us was formed in March of 2023. It was this scrappy group of young people who jumped on a Zoom call and were like, we got to make something happen. We had no idea what we were doing, frankly. And we wanted to respond to the moment around policy reforms that were happening in our country related to social media. So all of you have probably seen that the clip of Zuckerberg from 2018, where he's asked, Mr. Zuckerberg, how do you make money? And he goes, Senator, we run ads. And then he kind of does that creepy smile that he does. That was what our government was doing in approaching policy. And as a result, we had some pretty bad policy proposals over the past couple of years. I think Congress, and I'll hedge my bets on this, but even now and on both sides of the aisle has gotten remarkably better at being able to understand and create policy reforms because they understand the products better and they're smart people who are building at that level. But I don't want to take too much credit, but I also think it's because of the engagement of advocacy organizations like ourselves who pushed our way into rooms that we didn't think that we would ever end up in. So what I mean by that is, as lawmakers were developing the initial drafts of the Kids Online Safety Act, for example, there was very little to no youth involvement. Young people are traditionally not thought of as stakeholders in the policy space. Like, let's be real. It's primarily lobbying organizations and entrenched advocacy groups. And so to get young people into rooms where you can make an impact is really difficult. Then once you're there, you actually have to show that you know your stuff. And very early on, when we would have conversations with policymakers and their staff, it was like, oh, the kids are here, what are they going to say? And so we really had to show up with a set of expertise and know the politics in and out as well. It wasn't just the policy. We needed to have a sense of the environment that nobody would be able to question us on. And so that got us into rooms that, I honestly am shocked that how far we got in the short time that we've been around. Design It For Us has met with the Office of the Speaker of the House. We've met with the Office of the Senate Majority Leader in the previous Congress. We've sat down with senior members of Congress and had these conversations with them in person in the Capitol, on Zoom, at the state level as well. And so Design It For Us began actually as a campaign to pass the California Age Appropriate Design Code, this bill that would do what you described. The core of what we believe is that social media should be reformed. We should put the onus on the companies, and the onus should be on the people inside these companies to build products that would be safer for us, designed for us, which is where the name comes from. When we ultimately started to get into these rooms, it was incredible to see the amount of young people who came to us and said, how do I get involved? And we're, pretty open door. We're like, if you are passionate about this, let's get going on this. Let's work together. So the policy reforms that I believe in and that we believe in really stem from that idea of safety and privacy by design and holding social media companies accountable for their design features, for their products. There's a lot of talk right now about phone bans, social media bans. Should there be a minimum age for social media? I struggle with that because putting the onus on parents, on educators, on a third party, company to verify your age, those all present different challenges. And so that's why we've worked on state bills that mirror the Age Appropriate Design Code. That's why we spent last year working really, really hard on the Kids Online Safety Act. We came so close. Ultimately never got a vote in the House because of the vast lobbying arm of big tech. But, and I know this is a long response to your answer, but the one piece that I haven't actually talked about as publicly before, but I'm really interested in exploring is a little bit more political. The wave of activism that's going on right now within the Democratic Party to focus on oligarchy, I think presents a real unique focus to look back on the tech industry. And honestly, I'm surprised that we haven't been looking as much on the tech industry through that lens. You can disagree with, Senator Sanders and Representative Ocasio-Cortez, but the core of what they're saying speaks to, I think, what is bigger structural problems that we're experiencing in this country today. And frankly, I'm surprised that our advocacy community, maybe it's incumbent on us to do this, isn't talking more about this. But if you're a Republican who believes in regulating big tech, which I know many of them do, we've worked with many of them before, I think you'd be pretty concerned about the 6 or 7 big tech CEOs who sat behind Zuckerberg at the inauguration, who booted out governors and heads of state, essentially for the oligarchy to show up behind the president-elect. And I think it is incumbent on us to have a serious conversation about the entrenched power that tech companies control in our government today, and ultimately how that's impacted us. Not only how it's impacted kids' online safety and privacy and the products that we've gotten today, like I was talking about before, but like Amazon, for example, makes copycat products of companies that are doing well on its own service because they know that they can make more money if they kick out those companies from its own marketplace. Google dominates 60-something% of search. Nobody else uses anything other than Google, but that's by design. So anyway, I say this all to say that we are long overdue a conversation in this country and this current political moment to talk about the entrenched power of companies and focus specific policies that put the onus and the autonomy back on us, because we as not only users but consumers, as young people growing up in this economy, as entrepreneurs, deserve that kind of choice. We deserve a future, an economic future, where we are able to make choices and not have them dictated by a couple of companies or a couple of people.
And on that note too, before we wrap up for audience Q&A, I'll ask you one more question. It's clear that tech policy lobbying is unprecedented right now. It's reaching unprecedented levels in a landscape where our ruling bodies are so dominated by things that we as people can't control. How do you continue to create spaces and gateways for youth to continue shaping tech policy?
Yeah, this gives me an opportunity to talk about the fantastic coalition members who make up Design It For Us. We're represented by over 250 coalition members, 18 member organizations, and the power that we've built has resonated in 36 states and 17 countries, last I checked. So the power of young people to actually have a voice and deliver on not only policy, but talking about this as an issue has grown so much in a short amount of time. So I think to answer your question, the power and the check on the tech industry is the voices of lived experience. We all have lived experience online. Like whether you think it's something that was monumental or life-changing or really was to you, or whether it's simply that Instagram made you feel bad one day. That is all lived experience. And so we always talk about lived experience being our expertise as something that nobody can ever take away from us. And when we get into policy conversations, moves the needle forward. Because it doesn't matter what industry lobbyist so-and-so is going to say in that meeting before we get in there, because our voice and our lived experience has the ability to move the needle on this issue. And so I'm just incredibly in awe of the young people who have built this coalition and built this movement, because it really is, a constellation of organizations, of young people who are leading the fight on this as an issue, some of whom are in the room today. And I think the power of what young people have been able to build has been recognized by the media, by policymakers, and shows that the ability to push back on a industry that is as powerful as the tech industry is really unique. And I think it creates a conversation and a roadmap for what this looks like for other movements to come.
Thank you for sharing. And I could continue asking questions, but for the sake of time, I'm going to turn it to the audience. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and I will call on you.
So given all of your expertise on, how these tech companies operate and the way they view us as individuals, how do you spend your day on your phone? And when you're on social media, what are you actively thinking about?
It's a great question because it's like a constant struggle. Because I have full knowledge of like how certain design features were built or, the research that went in behind it. But, I'm 22, I'm the same generation as all of you. So much of our life happens online, and that's just how it is. So I try and do a lot to create friction in my own digital usage. It's taken time. It's taken a lot of work. But, for example, I deleted Instagram. I was talking to somebody else earlier today about how I just use Instagram on the browser now. And the dumbed down UX experience is honestly gratifying. It gives me back some autonomy. I'm not scrolling mindlessly on Reels. I've tried things like the time limit feature or some of these apps that allow you to build in that friction. Ultimately, you're training your brain on whatever the next friction point is. So if you know that you're going to get that 30-minute pop-up and you're just going to tap out of it after a couple weeks. So I think where we can create opportunities of friction for us to be able to take a step back, that's where I find value again in using social media, where I have some autonomy again, where I feel like I can go onto this app and not have it kind of called back to me. So my notifications, for example, on Instagram and TikTok are off. I don't spend a lot of time on TikTok, but when I do, I'm kind of mindful of why was this video served to me? What about my algorithm tells the company that this would be something that I'm interested in? And just those mental checks create a sense of disruption that it doesn't feel so numbing to be using social media.
It seems when it comes to challenging big tech, there is a trend of more younger voices as yourself, speaking out against it. For instance, Lena Khan was the youngest to serve the FTC chair at 32. So I was just curious, from the perspective of someone so active in it, do you see your youth as being not just being incidental, but actually critical to being able to challenge these power structures in big tech?
I love this question. Well, first of all, I'm a huge fan of Chair Khan, the former chair of the Federal Trade Commission. She, I think, really showed a lot of young people. I mean, it's been fascinating to see how many young people know who she is, know the work that she did at the FTC. Sometimes I'll ask people to name the previous FTC chair, and nobody has any idea who it was. I think that shows that the work that she did previously is an indication of what vigorous new leadership brought by young people can actually drive. She was a law school student, wrote this fascinating paper on Amazon and antitrust, then was on the House Judiciary Committee, and so, had all these opportunities to really further her own experience, but then created this, this reinvigoration of an agency that's supposed to work for the people. That's what government ultimately is supposed to do, is work for us. And so that, to your question, I think she's a perfect example of why I think young people are at the core of making this kind of change happen. I think it's unfortunate in some ways. I've supported two colleagues who've testified before the one before the House, one before the Senate, who have shared their deeply personal stories about growing up with an eating disorder that was fueled by social media, it's incredibly challenging to me that, that's what we have to do to push the needle forward. But by the same token, I don't think it's just, we don't need to focus on these young people just as victims of what they've experienced. We can empower young people to talk about their experiences and their advocacy and the ideas that they believe in and what they want to do to change the product. And so, my hope is that the industry will one day have this calling and they'll create all these changes that we've been advocating for years. I think that's highly unlikely. What ultimately I think is going to happen is this continued groundswell of grassroots voices pushing the companies to be better. I have the privilege of having spent the past 2 years working with a group of bereaved moms who lost their children to social media related harms, sextortion, choking challenges. I mean, the list of harms goes on. But their power to move the needle in an incredibly fraught congressional landscape, in an incredibly divided political world, our shared power of young people and parents working together to take on something like Capitol Hill is what got us a 91-3 vote in the Senate on the Kids Online Safety Act. So I think it is that. I think it is the power of voices, and especially, obviously from my perspective, young voices that can move the needle forward.
And for the sake of time, we'll take one more question.
In terms of these bills in Congress, the pushback that comes from people who are advocating in favor of free speech, and specifically I think the queer community or certain communities online who feel like free speech is being challenged by those tech policies, what do you say to that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it is the center of what tech policy is talking about right now. What is the balance between free speech and regulating our digital ecosystem? And honestly, that line is incredibly difficult to be able to decipher. On the one hand, you have really well-intentioned legislation that's trying to protect young people online. On the other hand, you have people who actually want to censor things off the internet, including queer voices, including young people of minority backgrounds, and using their power in a way that we don't feel like is actually going to solve any problems. And then by the same token, you have kind of unintended consequences of good faith regulation. That is all questions that we're asking ourselves today. Couple things. First, this policy space is incredibly nascent. People are going to get things wrong. Governments are going to attempt to do the right thing and fail. Lawmakers are going to attempt to do the right thing and fail, and they'll learn from it, and they'll keep going, and they'll create and iterate and keep working. I think it also is critically important to elevate the voices of the people that you're talking about as well. Research by one of our partners, organization called Hope Lab, talks about how LGBTQ plus voices overwhelmingly experience more extremism and more hate online, but also find the most community in online spaces and on social media. So that's a really difficult needle to thread when you know that a community is actively being done harm by a product, but is also, by the same token, seeking community. And so I think that is the core of the nuance of this as an issue. We can't blanket this. We can't monolith this. We can't say, social media bad, get rid, social media good, has to stay. We have to keep asking ourselves, what are the right questions and the right policy considerations that move us in a direction that pushes the needle forward and actually does the most protection for the most amount of young people. Like I said, I don't think we're going to get that right every single time, and by we I mean the broader community of people who's working on this. But I think by grounding your work in principles such as I think what we do, which is safety and privacy by design, where you're focused on the product and not specific pieces of content, it brings together a broad swath of people who care about this as an issue and recognize that there are nuances and the value in unpacking those nuances.
For the sake of time, I'm going to wrap up our conversation for today, but thank you so much for being here with us. Can we get a round of applause going?
Thanks so much for having me.
Native education resources on campus